There comes a moment in the inner life of certain people when silence becomes louder than any explanation, not the silence of fear, but the silence of recognition. These are the ones often called empaths, though the word barely touches the depth of what they carry. From early on, they learned to listen beneath words, to feel what others avoided feeling themselves. They absorbed moods, unspoken wounds, invisible tensions, until their inner world became crowded with lives that were not their own. For a long time they believed this sensitivity was a duty. They stayed when it hurt, explained when it drained them, forgave when nothing changed. They told themselves that endurance was love, that understanding meant self-erasure. Each connection left a small mark, and over time those marks formed a quiet exhaustion, not a dramatic breakdown, but a slow dimming of the self. What eventually changes them is not anger. Anger still seeks connection. What changes them is clarity, a sudden, unsettling realization that their empathy has been feeding patterns that consume them. They begin to see how often their presence has allowed others to avoid growth, responsibility, or truth. They notice how their compassion has been mistaken for permission. In that realization, something ancient awakens, an instinct for psychic survival. This is when withdrawal begins, and it almost never announces itself. There is no confrontation, no long farewell. Words feel inadequate because the shift is not intellectual, it is archetypal. It feels like a door closing deep within the psyche. The empath recognizes that to remain accessible to everyone is to abandon themselves entirely. And so they step back, not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. To those left behind, it looks sudden and cold. To the empath, it feels like the first honest act of their life. They are no longer willing to play the role of healer in spaces that refuse healing. They no longer offer depth to those who only take from it. This is not punishment. It is differentiation, the painful but essential separation of self from the projections of others. Once this boundary is crossed, returning becomes nearly impossible. Not because the empath lacks forgiveness, but because awareness cannot be undone. They have seen the cost of unconscious closeness. They have felt what happens when the soul is treated as a resource rather than a presence. Going back would mean betraying the self they fought so hard to reclaim. In solitude, something unexpected happens. The silence that once felt like loneliness becomes fertile. They begin to hear their own thoughts without interference. Energy returns, not all at once, but steadily. Creativity stirs. Old interests resurface. For the first time, they experience relationships internally before offering them outwardly. This withdrawal is not the end of connection. It is the end of unconscious connection. When empaths do return to the world, if they do so differently, with fewer people, with clearer limits, with an unspoken understanding that access to their inner world is sacred, not guaranteed. Some never go back to who they were, and that is the point. The one who tolerated everything had to disappear for the authentic self to emerge. What looks like disappearance from the outside is, from within, an initiation. A descent followed by a quiet return, not to the same world, but to the same world seen with open eyes. And once an empath has learned the difference between compassion and self-betrayal, silence becomes a form of wisdom, distance becomes a form of love, and walking away becomes the most honest expression of wholeness they have ever known. Empaths absorb emotional realities so deeply that unconscious relationships slowly erode their sense of self. And this erosion rarely happens in dramatic moments that can be easily identified or named. It happens quietly through tone shifts, unspoken expectations, emotional atmospheres, and subtle demands that never appear as demands at all. From an early stage, such individuals learn to read rooms before they learn to read books. They sense tension before it is voiced, sadness before it is admitted, anger before it finds language. Their nervous system becomes attuned not to their own needs, but to the emotional weather of others, and over time this attunement becomes automatic, almost instinctual. Because of this sensitivity, they often step into relationships already leaning forward, already listening, already holding space that was never requested but is immediately occupied. Others feel seen, understood, relieved. The empath feels useful, connected, meaningful. Yet beneath this mutual exchange lies an imbalance that remains unconscious for a long time. The empath gives presence, emotional labor, containment, and understanding without realizing how rarely these are returned in equal measure. Their role slowly crystallizes into that of the emotional ground on which others stand. Unconscious relationships thrive on this dynamic. They do not require malice or ill intent. They simply follow the path of least resistance. When one person consistently adapts, absorbs, and accommodates, others unconsciously outsource parts of their emotional responsibility. They vent instead of reflect. They lean instead of stand. They rely instead of develop. The empath becomes a mirror that never turns away, and mirrors that never turn away invite projection. Over time, the empath begins to carry emotions that are not theirs. They feel drained after conversations without understanding why. They sense guilt that does not belong to them. They carry anxiety that emerged from someone else's unresolved inner conflicts. Because they are highly perceptive, they often blame themselves for this exhaustion, assuming they are too sensitive, too weak, too demanding. The idea that the relationship itself may be unbalanced remains buried beneath layers of self-questioning. What makes this erosion particularly insidious is that it disguises itself as virtue. Patience is praised. Understanding is admired. Forgiveness is celebrated. The empath internalizes the belief that to love deeply means to tolerate endlessly. Boundaries begin to feel like betrayal. Self-assertion feels like cruelty. Silence feels safer than expression. Each time they suppress a reaction to maintain harmony, a small piece of their authentic self is pushed into the background. As years pass, this suppression accumulates. The empath may still function well outwardly, appearing calm, supportive, even strong. Internally, however, there is a growing sense of fragmentation. Desires become harder to identify, preferences blur. The question, "What do I feel?" is replaced by "What do they need?" The inner voice grows faint, drowned out by the constant awareness of others. Unconscious relationships rarely recognize this cost because the empath rarely names it. When discomfort does surface, it often appears as fatigue, numbness, or a vague sense of dissatisfaction rather than clear resentment. The empath may withdraw briefly, rest, and return, believing the issue has been resolved, not realizing that rest does not heal identity erosion. Only consciousness does. The erosion deepens because the empath's openness attracts those who are disconnected from their own inner world. People who avoid introspection gravitate toward those who can feel for them. In these dynamics, the empath becomes the emotional processor for the relationship, interpreting, soothing, stabilizing. This role can feel meaningful, even essential, but it slowly replaces mutuality with function. The empath is valued for what they provide, not for who they are when they are not providing anything at all. At some point, a subtle inner conflict emerges. The empath begins to sense that something is wrong, though they cannot yet articulate it. They may feel invisible despite being constantly present. They may feel lonely in the middle of connection. They may notice that when they stop giving, even briefly, the relationship falters or becomes tense. This observation plants a seed of awareness that cannot easily be undone. As awareness grows, the empath starts to see how much of their identity has been shaped in reaction to others rather than in alignment with themselves. They recognize patterns of over-adaptation, emotional overextension, and self-neglect. Memories surface of moments when they wanted to speak but chose silence, when they needed support but offered it instead, when they felt depleted but continued to give. These moments gather into a quiet but undeniable truth. This truth is not comfortable. It destabilizes the empath's self-image as endlessly understanding and emotionally resilient. It forces them to confront the idea that their empathy, while genuine, has been unconsciously weaponized against their own integrity. They begin to understand that empathy without boundaries becomes self-abandonment, and self-abandonment cannot coexist with wholeness. The realization does not immediately lead to action. Often there is a period of grief for the time lost, for the self that was postponed, for the needs that were never honored. There is also fear, because the empath senses that reclaiming the self will require disrupting familiar relational patterns. To change would mean risking disapproval, misunderstanding, or loss. Yet once the erosion has been seen, it continues even more painfully if ignored. Awareness sharpens sensitivity instead of dulling it. The empath can no longer unknow what they know. Each interaction becomes a mirror reflecting either self-respect or self-betrayal. The cost of unconscious relationships becomes clearer with every exchange, with every moment of emotional labor that goes unacknowledged, with every expectation that remains unspoken but fully enforced. Gradually, the empath begins to feel an inner resistance where compliance once flowed automatically. Their body reacts before their mind does. Fatigue arrives sooner. Irritation surfaces unexpectedly. Silence stretches longer. These are not flaws, they are signals. The psyche, having endured long periods of erosion, begins to protect itself in the only language it has left. This stage is often misunderstood by both the empath and those around them. Others may sense a change and interpret it as withdrawal, coldness, or selfishness. The empath may feel guilt for no longer being endlessly available. Yet beneath this discomfort lies a slow reconstruction of identity. The self, long overshadowed, begins to step forward, tentative but persistent. As this process unfolds, the empath starts to recognize that not all closeness is intimacy, and not all distance is rejection. They see that unconscious relationships demand constant access, while conscious ones respect limits. They realize that their sensitivity was never meant to dissolve them into others, but to deepen connection without erasing individuality. The erosion of self did not happen because the empath was weak, but because they were open in a world that often confuses openness with availability. Understanding this reframes their entire history. What once felt like personal failure begins to look like a natural consequence of unconscious emotional exchange. And in this reframing, the empath stands at the threshold of a profound inner shift, where empathy no longer flows outward at the expense of the self, but begins to circulate inward, restoring what was slowly worn away by years of unexamined connection, quiet accommodation, and the persistent belief that love must always cost something of the one who feels the most. The decision to cut people off arises from clarity and self-preservation, not anger or revenge. And this distinction is essential because anger still seeks recognition, while revenge still depends on the other. What emerges in the empath is something far quieter and far more unsettling. A calm awareness that remaining accessible is no longer possible without losing the self entirely. This awareness does not arrive in a single moment of conflict, but unfolds gradually as patterns repeat themselves with such consistency that denial becomes impossible. For a long time, the empath attempts to solve relational strain through understanding. They analyze, contextualize, excuse, and forgive. They assume that if they can just explain better, listen more deeply, or become even more patient, the imbalance will correct itself. Each attempt reinforces the same outcome. The empath gives, the other receives, and nothing fundamentally changes. This repetition begins to strip emotion from the process, replacing hurt with observation. Observation is where clarity is born. The empath starts noticing how rarely accountability appears without prompting, how growth is postponed because someone else is always willing to carry the emotional weight. They notice how their presence stabilizes situations that would otherwise force confrontation or change. This realization is deeply uncomfortable because it reveals a hidden participation in dynamics that no longer feel aligned with truth. As clarity sharpens, emotional reactions soften. The empath is no longer fueled by resentment or pain, but by understanding. They see how unconscious dependence has shaped the relationship on both sides. They recognize that their empathy has been misinterpreted as limitless tolerance, and that their silence has been mistaken for agreement. This understanding removes the impulse to argue, explain, or persuade. There is nothing left to convince. Self-preservation enters quietly, almost impersonally. It does not demand dramatic action. It simply withdraws energy from places where it cannot survive. The empath realizes that continuing to engage would require further self-neglect, further distortion of their inner truth. This is not framed as punishment or moral judgment, but as necessity. Just as the body pulls away from what causes harm, the psyche does the same once awareness is complete. One of the most misunderstood aspects of this withdrawal is its lack of hostility. Those who expect confrontation are unsettled by silence. The empath does not list grievances or deliver ultimatums because the decision has moved beyond the realm of negotiation. To explain would require reopening a door that must remain closed. Words would only dilute the clarity that has finally emerged. This clarity also dismantles the need for validation. Earlier, the empath may have hoped to be understood, to have their experience acknowledged. Now, they recognize that understanding from the other is not required for the decision to be valid. This marks a significant internal shift. The empath stops measuring their truth against external acceptance. The inner compass replaces the external mirror. Self-preservation, in this context, is not selfishness but integration. The empath begins to experience their energy as finite and sacred rather than endlessly renewable. They recognize that their capacity to feel deeply is not a resource to be distributed indiscriminately, but a responsibility to be protected. This reframing changes the meaning of connection entirely. Guilt often arises during this stage, but it is quieter than before. It is no longer overwhelming or paralyzing. The empath observes guilt rather than obeying it. They begin to distinguish between guilt that signals genuine wrongdoing and guilt that emerges when old roles are abandoned. This distinction weakens the emotional hooks that once kept them entangled. As they step back, the empath may feel a strange emptiness, not loneliness, but space. The absence of constant emotional engagement creates room that feels unfamiliar. In this space, the empath begins to sense how much of their identity was defined by responsiveness. Without others to attune to, they must turn inward. This turning inward is not immediately comforting. It exposes neglected needs, unexpressed desires, and long-suppressed anger that was never allowed full expression. Yet even this discomfort confirms the necessity of the decision. The empath sees that staying connected would have required continuing to avoid this inner encounter. Cutting off is not an escape from discomfort, but an entry into a more honest form of it. This is why the decision does not reverse itself. The The empath understands that going back would mean abandoning the very clarity that now sustains them. Those on the outside may interpret this withdrawal as cruelty or emotional coldness, but this interpretation reveals more about expectation than reality. The empath is no longer willing to perform emotional labor without reciprocity. They are no longer available to absorb what others refuse to face. This boundary feels radical only because it arrives after a long history of self-erasure. The absence of anger is what makes the cutoff permanent. Anger burns out, clarity remains. Once the empath sees the pattern, they cannot unsee it. Once they feel the relief of alignment, they cannot return to dissonance. The nervous system itself resists regression. What once felt normal now feels invasive. In time, the empath recognizes that self-preservation is not an act against others, but an act toward wholeness. It restores internal coherence. Thoughts, feelings, and actions begin to align. The inner conflict that once drained them starts to dissolve. This internal harmony becomes non-negotiable, not because it is fragile, but because it is finally real. The cutoff, then, is not a dramatic ending but a quiet conclusion. It is the moment when the empath stops trying to save relationships at the cost of the self. There is no triumph in this realization, no sense of victory. Only a steady, grounded knowing that the self can no longer be postponed, diluted, or compromised for the sake of connection, and that survival of the inner world sometimes requires walking away without explanation, without anger, and without looking back. Quiet withdrawal marks the end of unconscious connection and the beginning of inner differentiation. And this transition is rarely visible from the outside because it unfolds almost entirely within the psyche. There is no single incident that announces it, no argument that defines it, no dramatic rupture that can be clearly pointed to. Instead, there is a subtle shift in perception, a moment when the empath realizes that what once felt like closeness was often a form of fusion, and that fusion has a cost that can no longer be ignored. Unconscious connection thrives on blurred boundaries. Feelings move freely between people without being clearly owned. Responsibility drifts instead of being carried. Expectations remain unspoken yet fully enforced. For the empath, this environment feels familiar because it mirrors an early internal world where adaptation ensured safety and attunement ensured belonging. They learned to merge in order to remain connected, to soften edges in order to avoid conflict, to feel for others as a way of securing relational stability. Quiet withdrawal begins when this pattern becomes visible. The empath starts noticing how often they are thinking, feeling, and reacting on behalf of others. They recognize how quickly they anticipate needs that were never voiced and how automatically they minimize their own. This recognition does not create immediate distance, but it introduces a pause. In that pause, the empath experiences something new, the possibility of not responding. That possibility is both liberating and terrifying. To not respond feels like a violation of an internal rule that has governed relationships for years. Silence creates tension inside the empath, long before it creates tension outside. Yet, as the empath tolerates this discomfort, they begin to feel the contours of a self that exists independently of constant engagement. This is the first step toward differentiation. Differentiation is not separation in the physical sense. It is the psychological experience of being a self in the presence of others without dissolving into them. For someone who has lived in unconscious connection, this feels foreign. The empath may initially mistake differentiation for selfishness or emotional coldness because it contrasts so sharply with their habitual responsiveness. Yet over time, the difference becomes clearer. Selfishness closes the heart. Differentiation stabilizes it. As withdrawal deepens, the empath becomes more selective with attention and energy. They may respond less quickly, share less automatically, explain less frequently. These changes are subtle but significant. Each small act of non-engagement reinforces the boundary between self and other. This boundary does not reject connection, it defines it. Internally, the empath begins to experience a shift in identity. Without the constant reference point of others' emotions, they must confront their own. Feelings that were once overshadowed emerge with surprising intensity. Anger surfaces where patience once reigned. Sadness appears where understanding once softened pain. These emotions were always present, but were redirected outward to maintain relational harmony. Now, with withdrawal, they return to their rightful place. This return can feel destabilizing. The empath may question who they are without their relational role. They may feel empty, unanchored, or disoriented. Yet this emptiness is not absence. It is space. Space where the self can begin to take shape without constant interference. Differentiation requires this space even when it feels uncomfortable. Unconscious connection often involves projection. Others project needs, fears, and unresolved conflicts onto the empath, who receives them without protest. As withdrawal occurs, these projections lose their landing place. This can provoke confusion or frustration in others, who may sense a change without understanding its source. The empath becomes less available as a container for what does not belong to them. This shift exposes the true nature of certain relationships. Some dissolve quietly when unconscious connection is no longer possible. Others attempt to pull the empath back into familiar patterns through guilt, obligation, or emotional intensity. The empath feels these pulls but increasingly recognizes them as signals rather than commands. Each resisted pull strengthens differentiation. The inner dialogue of the empath also changes. Instead of asking how to maintain harmony, they begin asking what feels true. Instead of prioritizing emotional safety for others, they prioritize internal coherence. These questions were once unthinkable because they threatened the relational fabric. Now, they become essential. Differentiation does not eliminate empathy, it refines it. The empath still feels deeply, but feeling no longer requires absorption. Compassion no longer requires self-sacrifice. Understanding no longer demands agreement. This recalibration transforms the quality of connection. Interactions become clearer, less charged, more grounded. Quiet withdrawal also alters the empath's relationship with solitude. Solitude was once experienced as abandonment or failure. Now it becomes a laboratory for self-discovery. In solitude, the empath notices preferences forming, boundaries clarifying, values articulating themselves without negotiation. This internal development would have been impossible within the constant noise of unconscious connection. As differentiation strengthens, the empath becomes less reactive. Emotional storms that once swept through them now pass at a distance. They can witness without merging, respond without overextending, care without collapsing. This stability does not make them invulnerable, but it makes them real. What emerges through this process is a self that is no longer defined by usefulness. The empath begins to experience worth that is not contingent on emotional labor. This is a radical shift for someone whose identity was built around responsiveness. It challenges deep-seated beliefs about love, belonging, and value. Quiet withdrawal is therefore not an act of avoidance, but an act of initiation. It marks the crossing from unconscious participation to conscious presence. The empath no longer seeks to be needed at the cost of being known. They no longer confuse intensity with intimacy or fusion with closeness. The beginning of inner differentiation is often invisible and misunderstood, but it is one of the most profound psychological transformations an empath can undergo. It reorients the entire inner world, creating a center that no longer depends on external validation or emotional exchange for stability. From this center, connection becomes a choice rather than a compulsion. Presence becomes intentional rather than automatic, and relationship becomes a meeting of two distinct selves rather than a quiet disappearance of one into the other once awareness is gained. Returning to old relational patterns feels like self-betrayal rather than forgiveness, and this shift is one of the most irreversible stages in the empath's inner evolution. Awareness does not simply add new information to the psyche. It reorganizes perception itself. What was once tolerated without question now registers as misalignment. What once felt familiar now feels invasive. The empath does not become harsher, but clearer, and clarity changes the emotional meaning of past behaviors. Before awareness, forgiveness was often automatic. It flowed from empathy, from the ability to see context, pain, and limitation in others. The empath forgave not because harm was absent, but because understanding dissolved the sense of personal injury. After awareness, forgiveness still exists, but it no longer demands proximity. The empath recognizes that forgiving someone does not require continued access to their inner world. This distinction fundamentally alters how relationships are evaluated. Old relational patterns were built on unconscious agreements. The empath would listen without limits, accommodate without acknowledgement, and adapt without protest. These agreements were rarely spoken, yet they structured the relationship. Once awareness arises, these invisible contracts become visible. The empath sees not only how much was given, but how expected that giving had become. Returning to such patterns would mean re-entering agreements that are now fully understood and consciously rejected. The sense of self-betrayal comes from this understanding. Betrayal is not about being wronged by another, it is about violating one's own truth. After awareness, the empath knows what happens internally when boundaries dissolve. They know the cost of silence, the weight of emotional overextension, the slow erosion of identity. To willingly step back into that environment would require ignoring this knowledge. The psyche resists such regression with surprising intensity. This resistance is not dramatic. It appears as unease, tension, or quiet refusal. The empath may consider reconnecting and feel an immediate internal contraction. The body reacts before the mind can rationalize. This somatic response is the psyche's way of enforcing integration. Awareness has moved from insight to embodiment, and the body will not cooperate with self-abandonment. Forgiveness, after awareness, becomes more precise. The empath may release resentment, wish the other well, and hold compassion for their limitations. Yet compassion no longer overrides self-respect. The empath understands that compassion without boundaries enables repetition. Forgiving no longer means reopening doors that lead back to the same psychic terrain. This creates a new relationship with memory. Past interactions are reinterpreted through the lens of awareness. Moments that were once minimized or forgotten take on new significance. The empath recognizes patterns where their needs were consistently secondary, where their voice was present only to support another's narrative. These memories do not provoke rage, but they reinforce clarity. They remind the empath why returning is not an option. There is often pressure, both internal and external, to resume old patterns in the name of maturity or spiritual growth. The empath may be told that holding distance is bitterness, that true forgiveness requires reunion, that growth means rising above boundaries. Awareness allows the empath to see the distortion in these messages. Growth does not require self-erasure. Healing does not require reenactment. As this understanding stabilizes, the empath's sense of responsibility shifts. They no longer feel responsible for others' emotional comfort, reactions, or development. This does not mean indifference. It means appropriate placement of responsibility. Each person carries their own inner work. The empath steps out of roles that once made them indispensable but invisible. Returning to old patterns would also disrupt the internal harmony that awareness has created. The empath begins to experience alignment between thoughts, emotions, and actions. Decisions feel coherent rather than conflicted. There is less inner negotiation, less justification, less self-doubt. Old patterns would reintroduce fragmentation, forcing the empath to split between what they know and what they do. This coherence becomes deeply valued. It brings a sense of dignity that was previously unfamiliar. The empath no longer measures worth through endurance or sacrifice. They measure it through integrity. Integrity becomes the new standard for connection. Relationships that threaten integrity, no matter how familiar or emotionally charged, are quietly declined. The irreversibility of this stage can feel isolating. The empath may realize that many relationships were sustained only through unconscious participation. As awareness withdraws that participation, those connections fade. This loss is real and must be grieved, yet grief does not imply regret. The empath understands that the pain of loss is preferable to the pain of self-betrayal. Over time, the empath becomes more comfortable with being misunderstood. They recognize that not everyone will understand their distance, and that understanding is no longer required. The need to explain dissolves. Explanations belong to a phase when the self was still seeking permission. Awareness no longer seeks permission. What replaces old patterns is not rigidity, but discernment. The empath remains open, but not porous. Available, but not accessible to all. Warm, but not unguarded. This nuanced posture allows for connection that does not threaten the self. It also makes the cost of regression immediately apparent. Returning would mean forgetting lessons that were learned through suffering, reflection, and courage. The empath honors those lessons by living them. This honoring is not loud or performative. It is expressed through choices, through absence, through the quiet maintenance of boundaries that no longer feel negotiable. Awareness reshapes the empath's inner moral landscape. What once seemed virtuous now appears destructive. What once seemed selfish now appears necessary. This reorientation is not theoretical, it is lived. The empath moves through the world with a different center of gravity, one that cannot support old relational dynamics without collapsing inward. In this state, self-betrayal feels far more painful than separation. The empath chooses distance not because they lack love, but because they have learned how easily love can be distorted when it is not grounded in self-respect. Awareness stands as a permanent threshold, and once crossed, the empath understands that some doors must remain closed not to punish the past, but to protect the truth that finally emerged within them.